Hello, friends. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Elliot Parker, and whether you're a writer, a reader, or a lover of words, I invite you to stop what you're doing and join me for a page break. Taking a page break with us today is author Jayme Ringleb. The title of today's new collection of poems is called So Tall It Ends in Heaven, and I'm so excited to talk about this collection today and to give you an opportunity to hear some of the words, the beautiful words that are in this collection actually being read to you. So you get a wonderful sense of just how special and unique and great all of these poems are. And Jayme is our guest. He joins us today, very accomplished writer and poet, as well as a teacher of creative writing. They is the recipient of the Academy of American Poets Prize, scholarships to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference and the Sewanee Writers Conference. They has also received fellowships to the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop, as well as the Lambda Literary Writers Retreat. They's editorial work includes service with PEN America, the Adroit Journal, and Southeast Review. They was raised in Upstate, South Carolina, and also Northern Italy. And they earned his PhD at Florida State University, where he also received a postdoctoral teaching fellowship from 2020 to 2021. They currently lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we're pleased to announce that he is a brand new assistant professor of English at Meredith College. And so, Jayme, hello, welcome to Page Break. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your time.
I'm so glad to have you here. I'm so glad to have you. And I've been following everything that's been going on with this book, cyber stalking on Facebook to find out how all this has unfolded and when everything is going to come out. We should point out that the collection of poems we're talking about tonight will be out 1 week from today, And so very excited about that. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about collecting poems and putting together a collection. I've interviewed poets before, and I know all poets have sort of a different process and a different way for determining what writing is going to go into a collection. So how did you decide what material was ultimately going to be put into this collection of poems? How did you go about that? What was that process like for you?
It was a really slow process. And, you know, as much as I wanted to kind of sit with the book as a project and figure it out beforehand, kind of map it out beforehand, that just wasn't the process that worked for me. The book as it is kind of centers itself around a particular narrative arc. And that wasn't, I wanted to kind of work with a particular narrative arc, but the narrative arc that ended up emerging wasn't really the one that I envisioned. Every time that I would try to write poems toward this initial idea of here's what the story is, they wouldn't really work. I don't know why I can't do that, but I wasn't able to. It felt like I was really kind of shoddily paving in holes, as opposed to letting the poems determine their own narrative. And so that was the kind of reverse procedure, by comparison at least to what I anticipated going into the book. It was sitting down with these poems, figuring out which ones I wanted to retain inside of the manuscript, and that worked or spoke together along this kind of narrative that told a story about a speaker I wanted to invest time in and to give this kind of story to. As far as like poems that made it in or out, it just kind of it depended. It was mostly in terms of the poems that I found over time were the strongest. So I don't know, survival of the poem fittest, whatever that is.
Very good. Was there a moment when you were working on these poems and developing a theme where you had a moment where you realized, okay, I've got enough for a collection, or okay, I'm going to make this into a collection? Did that happen for you, or did you know all along that was what was going to come from it? What was that process like? When did you make that decision that you had enough material for a collection?
Very late in the process. It's probably been 10 years in the making, the collection. And it first started out when I was still living in Oregon. And at the time I had enough for maybe a short manuscript of poems. But it wasn't until I moved later to Florida and that I felt like I had a much fuller version, and even a while after that. So, still 5 years from that initial version. In the meantime, many poems changed were cut, were replaced, and then the narrative kind of solidified along clearer lines. But I think the moment that I knew, hey, here's what's coming together, was at some point in my last years at Oregon. I studied at the University of Oregon. I was working with my advisor, Jerry Doran, and we had a particular conversation about a sequence of poems that's in the third section of the book, that once that was there, it kind of locked things in place. I had what I thought were strands, and at that point, things got collected into something that was a little bit more cohesive, and ultimately narrative.
Very good. But before we dip into the poems, I wanted to ask you, you're from South Carolina, you lived in Oregon, you mentioned Florida. I know you've spent some time living in Northern Italy. You've been really all over the country, halfway across the world. As a writer, what was it like living in those different places? Because, obviously Florida has a different culture than Oregon, and Northern Italy has a different culture than Oregon and Florida,
Yeah.
and South Carolina thrown in there. What was that like living in all those different places? And did that enrich your perspective as a poet living in those different places?
Yeah, I think it enriched it and it also reinforced it. And so I don't, there might be a kind of a chicken and egg philosophical outlook somewhere in there. But yeah, I think so. The collection is very much a collection that takes place in various spaces, including all of those that you've mentioned. And that kind of space obsessiveness, I think, helps a little bit when it comes to tracking like narrative movement by moving from one place to another. That also signals kind of progress in time. But it also, for this particular speaker, and this is the reinforcing part, has a tendency to reinforce ideas of like dislocation. The speaker feels in a lot of different scenarios a lack of belonging. And so in attempting to reconcile that belonging, an additional obstacle, but also additional sources of being able to like see himself or to reflect come through nature. And so that's this strange kind of, symbol is probably too strong of a word, but this idea of something that signals a distance, but through which the speaker can also understand that distanced self a little bit better.
I'm glad you mentioned distance, because I think that is really central to what we see in this thematically connected series of poems. Because we find out as we keep reading throughout this collection, that you have a speaker, a queer Southern speaker here, who has an estranged, to put it mildly, relationship with his father, and we get a sense that the father lives overseas. The father is across the oceans and is sort of in a different culture, in a different environment, than the son. But it's more than just geography that kind of keeps them apart. Can you talk a little bit about that? What it is that they have the physical distance, but there's also a sense of a cavernous distance that exists between them on a more emotional level. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what's going on with the speaker and the father, and what the speaker is trying to ultimately get from his father or gain from his father in his writing, and sort of directing things towards him?
Yeah, what the speaker has received, even at the beginning of the book, from his father is a sense of, and maybe a need for, certain types of devotion. And the speaker is kind of filled in those devotions through romantic relationships, and through spiritual relationships, both of which have failed him ultimately. As a result of that devotion on the part of the father, it's a religious devotion, and that has isolated or alienated him from his son, because the two are in that case not compatible. The father has disowned the son because of the son's sexuality, and after this kind of series of failures of marriage, of spirituality, of kind of rekindling relationships with others, the kind of central journey of the collection becomes this voyage back to the father to try and bridge a gap. And it's also, to kind of talk a little bit to that doubleness of distance but reflection of nature. As much as it's a voyage back to the father, it's also a voyage back to the speaker's self, to a kind of idea of self-love that ultimately is the psychological trajectory for the speaker.
And the speaker we're talking about exists in this collection of poems, and it is published by Jayme Ringleb through Tin House Press. It's called So Tall It Ends in Heaven, and that's the poems that we've been focusing on and talking about in our time together. I wanted to ask you, Jayme, I wanted to read I wrote just down, I highlighted a couple lines from one of the poems and have you just give some context to it, if you would, because it's a few lines of poetry that stuck with me long after I finished reading your book. And it's basically this: nobody will love you like this poem does, your speaker says. Tell this poem what you want, anything. Can you tell a little bit about that and kind of what's going on there and what the speaker is sort of feeling and dealing with in that particular section? I know that's a small section, but those lines really stood out to me.
Yeah, there are a few poems in the book that begin with this language of love poems. So, love poem to the son my father wished for, love poem so tall it ends in heaven. The lines that you just quoted from are from a poem that's just called Love Poem, and it's the last of the titled love poems in the collection. And it is in some ways an effort to reclaim the notion of a love poem away from romantic love and more toward self-love, and being able to use the love poem itself to find in the speaker a means of loving himself. So the you in the poem and the speaker of the poem are the same. So nobody will love you like this poem does is the speaker saying this almost to himself. It's to kind of create this object that can last as an artifact of devotion in lieu of other kind of failed placeholders, that signals to him a capacity for love and a capacity also of being loved. So this idea of, tell this poem what you want, anything, it's in some ways questioning, in some ways reaching for what it is that love can do, and also reaching for what it is that poems can do. It's like a kind of last test in the collection. Well, if nothing else, maybe this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well said. I just love those lines, and those were some lines that really stood with me long after I finished closing the back cover of the book. One of the things I also like, sort of stylistically, about your poetry collection is that so much is said in so few words, and every word has meaning, and every word builds into the next word and the next line or the next stanza, or however the poem is constructed. And I just love that. I mean, it really makes you sort of pay close attention to the language and how it all relates and plays off of each other. I just wanted to ask you, stylistically as a poet, is that something you feel like that is a trademark of yours, or was that something that was just really specific and unique to this particular collection based on the theme and the speaker and kind of what he's going through?
I like concision, and I gravitate toward it. Sometimes I gravitate toward it, I find, in my own revisions far too hard. I have to go back to previous versions so that I can actually make sense. But some of the collection, or some of the poems in the collection, there's one that's called the Ars Poetica for the Devil. It has this kind of stricture, this formal kind of stricture where it can't exceed 3 words per line. And that is very much an effort to say what I can within only a certain amount of time or a certain amount of words. I don't know if I have like an elegant reasoning behind doing that. I think part of it is because it's an inheritance of what I've been taught, that concision is this kind of like golden, ideal. And I'm not sure, whether that's necessarily true, but it has been something that, especially as I was developing this book and continuing in the writing of it, to really set the foundation for my education as a poet, it was something that I kept in mind, and then betrayed at other parts of the collection, where I was like, all prose all the time. So I think one of the things that I wanted to do with it more than anything else is to establish a kind of tension, to establish this idea of like, here's really succinct kind of clipped lines, and then to see next to it these lines that just keep going and going and going and going, to signal at certain points emotional states of the speaker, but also moments of disclosure, so that a poem that is clipped is very withholding, whereas the other is kind of like, I don't even have enough time or space to tell it all,
The poems we were talking about, So Tall It Ends in Heaven, Jayme Ringleb. These are these poems, and we're so happy to be talking to him about it. So we're going to stop for just a minute and talking about the poems and do our rapid fire segment. If you're new to Page Break and watching these interviews, we always stop about halfway through and we put our authors and our guests on the hot seat, and we ask them some fun questions and some questions related to their genre and what they write about. And we ask them to, they can expand on these as often as they want, or they can just give one word answers. So are you ready to be put on the hot seat for rapid fire?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So if it's not poetry, what's your favorite genre to read?
To read, I love fiction.
Okay.
Fiction for sure, and speculative particularly. I love fantastical thinking.
Very good, very good. Coke, Pepsi, tea, or something else?
Cheerwine. Carolinas, I'm sorry, but yeah, cheerwine.
Excellent. Are you a morning glory or a night owl?
Oh, I think I've recently shifted to being a morning glory. Used to be very hard in the night owl direction, but now I wake up and have energy, which is alarming to me and my partner and my dog. So we're adjusting.
Very good. So here's a poet wrestling match question, and you can answer this any way you want. Robert Frost or Henry David Thoreau?
Frost. I'll take Frost over Thoreau. Yeah.
Okay. Elizabeth Bishop or Sylvia Plath?
Oh, that's hard. So Sylvia Plath is the poet under whom I kind of had my education. I just sat with her books for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And so it's difficult for me to say anybody but her. But more recently, my education has come through Elizabeth Bishop. So it's a tie, but right now Bishop.
Bishop right now, perfect, excellent, excellent. What is your idea of a perfect day?
A perfect day, one in which I have no schedule, and a lot of food breaks. I think anything other than that is pretty negotiable, so long as it's chill, low maintenance, and a little bit on like the introverted side. So, communing with nature and things more than like dance party. But yeah, so long as it's food without a schedule, I'm pretty sated.
Excellent, excellent. So where's a place that you would like to visit that you have not visited?
A place that I would like to visit that I have not visited. I'm weirdly curious about Iceland. I think more than anything, I want to like see the Northern Lights. So like location might be fairly negotiable, but I have lived mostly in more equator adjacent zones. And so I haven't had the opportunity to see those. And Iceland, I just always want to go there, maybe because of a Bjork affection, but
very good. Yeah, I've had a couple friends that have gone to Iceland and Greenland, and they say Iceland is actually green and Greenland is actually ice. It's
I've heard this.
Yeah, it's not exactly what you would think. So, okay, last rapid fire question. What do you like most about being a college professor?
I like being able to engage with students on topics that surprise them because they're so meaningful to them. One of the things that I have the real privilege of doing right now at Meredith is teaching the first ever queer lit course. And there are so many conversations that we have in that room every single day that are really, really precious to me, in large part because none of us really expected necessarily to have those in an academic environment. And so being able to think deeply and with other people and make a safe space where that discourse can just kind of flow. That's my favorite. So it's in the classroom with the students for sure.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you very much for participating in the rapid fire segment. You're off the hot seat.
Excellent.
Thanks for that, and appreciate you giving us some insight into your background and your likes and dislikes and writing process and all of that. So thanks so much for that. We're talking with Jayme about the new collection of poems that belongs today. It's called So Tall It Ends in Heaven, and we'll come back to these here for just a second. Jayme, I wanted to ask you about writing all of these. If you found certain poems harder to write, easier to write, did it kind of come and go? You'd write a poem that came to you easily, and then there was one that was more difficult. How did all of that go? Did you have ones that were just so excruciating to write, but then ones that flowed easily? How did all of that work, or did you find it pretty even across the board?
There were like a couple that came with relative ease. So like there's one in there called Goat Feathers. I sat on it for a long time before actually kind of punching it out. But once it happened, at first I thought, I was like, oh no, I can't go any further with it. And so it's just incomplete. And then I went and had dinner with my advisor at FSU, Erin Ballou. And I was telling her about it, and she was like, well, read it to me. And so I read it to her, and she was like, I think that's done. And so that one kind of worked out. But the point, I suppose, is that I'm not aware of. I need validation whenever that happens, at least at this point. The rest of them are all kind of strange, like cannibals of many, many different versions of poems. So there's one that's called My Husband Lost in the Wild, and it existed in like 4 different forms that in some ways are very different from one another before getting even to like the original draft of the poem as it exists now. They're all kind of these amalgamations of drafts that I wrote before and I'm not fully satisfied with. So I'm an obnoxious total rewriter if dissatisfied, which is often when it comes to my own work. So the rest of it, I'm afraid, has been a little bit on the excruciating side.
Understand totally. Well, thank you for sharing that and being honest about needing the validation. And I think sometimes when people talk to writers or they listen to writers read or they read a writer's work, they think, oh, well, this must have just flown just smoothly. They just sat down in one draft, took care of it all. There was no self-doubt, no anguish, no sort of gnashing of teeth. And it's usually totally the opposite process if only people knew. So I appreciate you sharing that insight. That's really great. Jayme was nice enough to allow me to pick a poem to share with you, so you get a sense of what's going on in this collection and exactly how the poems are constructed and structured. And we've been talking a lot about those here on Page Break. And so he is going to read a poem that I loved and that was really my favorite. It's called Love Poem to the Son My Father Wished For. So Jayme, we'll turn the floor over to you, as they say, and give you an opportunity to share that with our audience, because it's just a beautiful poem and it's very moving. And I can't wait to hear it read in your voice. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for requesting it. Love Poem to the Son My Father Wished For. If I pause some nights when the sky seems particularly simple, the air barely carrying wafts of the neighbors' constant bonfires, the stars rubbed clean of their dull texture, if I pause to name the stars, as if by naming them I could love them more, I feel closer to you, even if it's too easy to love the stars, the way telling me what you've done to roughen your hands would be easy, or how you taught your daughters to drag after you a workshop trolley in the garage, naming all the pretty car parts, caliper, strut dust sleeve, chassis. I don't know what there is between a woman and a man, but you know how to make the body submissive and brave. When your father's God asks you to heat something small and metal, a ball bearing, maybe a fish hook or drywall nail, over a fire, to keep it in fire until it glows, and then to swallow it, you do. I love your mouth for this. Its coarsenesses, scabbed edges, numb scars. Your father's God has demanded so much of you. And now the burn-pitted tongue tastes nothing, would taste nothing, even if the mouth bent down to kiss me, if only to feel for a moment whether kisses could injure, better than God's. I have opened my mouth to God, but only men enter. I imagine them in their homes, milling, busying themselves with cookware, working to assemble new, oily grated grills, or just standing in the drive. As I imagine you do some nights, having bedded a wife and left a robe she loves folded over the wardrobe door, then slipping out, finally, in our grandfather's Mackinaw coat for a secret smoke, thinking sometimes of me when you take in the simple sky, whose stars you name as if they were children.
Mm. Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, that poem is just so raw. It's so real. It's what's wonderful. It's just my favorite one of the. I mean, it just got goosebumps listening to you read that, because it's just so wonderful to hear that in your voice, especially. So, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was
Well,
really
thank you.
so let me ask you, Jayme, as we finish up, if anyone wants to get in contact with they about the collection here, which we'll hold up one more time. Again, we want to remind you that this will be out on Tuesday, September the 20th. From Tin House Publishing. So you want to make sure that you put this on your to be read pile. But if anybody wants to get in contact with they about this, about anything else related to other things that they've been working on or dealing with, as in terms of writing or teaching or anything like that, where can they find they, first of all, and then where can they get copies of the collection?
Sure. The collection you can order through, your local bookstore. It's available at a lot of places online. Open Books Emporium, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can get it online there. And there are also links on my website, which is just jaymeringgleb.com. That's JaymeRingleb.com. There's also a contact field there if you want to get in touch, ask any questions. I'm here.
Jayme, thanks so much for taking a page break with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you.
We want to take a moment to also remind you, if you liked what you saw on this episode of Page Break, please be sure and leave us a comment. If you've got a comment or a question about this collection of poems, or one directed towards Jayme, we'll be sure that he gets those and that he's able to see them and respond to those. So leave those comments and questions down in the comments field. We also invite you to go over here and follow the channel on all the social media platforms that are available. So thanks for taking a page break with us, and we'll talk to you again soon.